This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website. This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jyoti Shukla and I am your subject coordinator for Land and Property Economics, ABPL 90416. Welcome to week 1, lecture 1. And as you can see, I have already mentioned that this is part 1 of the lecture. There is a small part in addition to this. And as in when we reach the stage where I can explain what is part 2, I'll let you know. So, as this is the introductory lecture, I would first want to start by introducing the subject, and it is important that we invest decent amount of time in understanding what this subject means so that we know the benefits of the subject, and in the process of learning we can take advantage of the subject when we know fully well what this subject entails for us. And this is a new subject, as you might be aware. And the need for introduction of this subject has been felt since past couple of years, and finally we could do that. So let's start this journey, and let's be hopeful that it will be beneficial for us in the long run. This subject forms the foundation for many other property subjects going forward in the journey of your property education. And even if you are in the property profession, not just the education. And before I start, I want to apologize. My throat is not very good, and you may get disturbed by the cough, but I'll try to keep it to minimal. So please forgive me for that. So to start with, I will first talk about what is the focus of this subject, and the focus is definitely economic functions of land, and I will explain what that means. We will also talk about defining land and property economics as a subfield of economics. And I would like to briefly touch upon the topics that we will cover in this subject, mostly concentrating on the bid rent theory and 4-quadrant diagram. These form the basis for land and property economics respectively. And in this introductory lecture, it is important that we understand the characteristics of real property. There are a wide range of characteristics of real property, which I have tried to bring together under some headings. So to define the characteristics, we will look into the definition of real property itself. The definition of real property entails characteristics of real property. We will look into the definition of property market, which also entails characteristics of real property. And then we will define what do we mean by market participants and what are those special characteristics of real property as opposed to other financial assets. And we will also try to understand how to assess property market outcomes and whether or not real property market is efficient. How do we define efficiency? And an important thing here to discuss would be institutions. And this is where part 2 of lecture is captured. And to make it more rich and knowledge rich for you, I have invited Piyush, and it will be more like a conversation with him through which we will try to understand the role of institutions in the property market and also the definition of institutions, property market institutions inclusive. Towards the end of the lecture, it will be important to assimilate the learning outcomes of this subject. Having understood what this subject is about, it will be easy to explain to you what are the learning outcomes of the subject and how do those outcomes benefit you in the property profession as a real estate and land economist and valuer. So there is a typo here. I would correct this. These are actually references which we will be using in this lecture. And most of these references, if you search on the library, you will find them, but I'll try to upload these references under readings online. However, I'm not sure whether copyright permissions will allow me to do that. To the extent it will, I will upload these for you for easy access. We are not expecting you to read all these references fully, but definitely if you want to look into the details of the topics that are referring to these resources, then you should refer to them if you want to look into the details. To start with the introduction of land and property economics, as I said that the focus of the subject is on economic functions of land and property. Now, the first and most obvious question to ask here is, what are economic functions of land? And to understand this question, I think it will be important for us to understand what are non-economic functions of land and how are economic functions different from non-economic functions. Now, I'm referring to a good resource here, which is titled The Role of Land in Economic Theory. And it's a very well-written paper. If you like to get into the details, you can. However, I'm not recommending that because the scope of this subject is limited to economic functions of land, while the paper explains other things as well. Now, let's try to understand what this slide is telling us. As you can understand that land has many functions, and land is a very crucial resource. It's scarce, it's valuable in various forms, and it encompasses a variety of functions which we may classify broadly under these categories, but it's not limited to these categories. Like, for example, land has environmental functions, and the role which land plays under environmental functions would be, say, for example, as soil or earth, as a sink of pollution, as a filter to drinking water, and definitely as a habitat for wildlife. Together, these functions or these roles of land contribute or can be categorized under environmental functions. Now, on similar lines, economic functions of land would entail, let's say, if we view land as a scarce space for locating economic production activities, infrastructure, dwelling, and probably actually production activities includes everything else. Infrastructure will be productive, dwellings will be productive, even commercial, retail, industrial, whatever will be produced or created on land will be a productive activity. It probably also includes as a productive activity agriculture. However, we define agriculture slightly differently because in the first case, we are talking about using the space on land, which is scarce. So we are talking about the role of land as a scarce space. In the second case, we are talking about the productivity of soil. When we are saying agricultural productivity as an economic function of land, we are referring to the productivity of soil of land as a characteristic or as a decisive attribute that will influence upon the agricultural productivity. The soil provides organic and inorganic nourishment to the agricultural produce. But again, it is economically productive activity and therefore an economic function of land. Now, the third point under economic function is when land is a provider of aesthetic value and amenity services. We know that the built environment is a combination of natural and built environment, and the value of any property or land is definitely appreciated by the aesthetic value that is added by the built and the natural environment together, and amenities and services. Now, this point, the third point here about aesthetic value and amenities, since I'm mentioning about aesthetic value brought in by the environmental or natural scenario and scenery around, and other natural elements around sea, water, water bodies, and wildlife. So then we are saying that there is some overlap between these functions as well, because those aesthetic values are essentially environmental or natural elements. So we are not denying that there will be overlaps across these roles, but still for our understanding, we are trying to separate them or categorize them under broad heads. Land is definitely a store of value and assets. And as property professionals, this will be an important realization for us throughout our course of education as well as profession. We all understand that the value of land appreciates being a scarce resource and being a productive resource. It generates value and it stores value. Now, land also has a societal function. We understand that ownership of land may act as a source of prestige and pride. And there is a lot of research that has gone into associating a personal identity with the identity of the place. We are not focusing on that. That is beyond the scope of this subject. But obviously, if you are interested, you can look into that. Land is also an organizing principle for socio-economic relationships. Probably a very simple way to explain this would be, let's say if you are a tenant at a place, as opposed to an owner, occupier, your involvement with your neighbors and surroundings and your sense of ownership and association with the neighborhood and surrounding is less if you are a tenant, because you know that you are only temporarily occupying this space. Whereas if you are an owner and you have intentions to be associated with that place as an occupier for a long run, you try to build relationships and you try to maintain those relationships in the long run. And you value those relationships. So those socio-economic relationships associated with land, and particularly with land ownership, are also a societal function of land. In the context of traditional societies, we can say that land also plays a spiritual role for some cultures, and land is seen as a deity that exercises control over its people. So these are all very important functions of land. However, as I said, and I would like to emphasize again, that the scope of this subject is limited to economic functions of land, which we will discuss in more detail as we keep moving forward in the subject. Another important thing to mention here is that we know that this is a wide range of functions that land offers to the owner, to the user. Now, if at a societal level, we misallocate ownership rights or use rights and access to land, then that means that we are misallocating access to these functions. And that can be a very unfair and non-efficient social system. So misallocation of land would inevitably entail misallocation of these valuable functions. And economics is about just distribution of scarce resource, and land is one of the most crucial scarce resource we are talking about. Moving forward, now we understand that these are four broad economic functions of land. It is important now to understand that what are the subfields in economics which deal with the above functions. Like, for example, if we talk about function 2 as a productive soil that provides organic and inorganic materials for agriculture, we are essentially talking about agricultural economics. Now, we all understand that back in time, agriculture was the only productive use of land. And therefore, there was a lot of emphasis upon agricultural productivity, and agricultural economics developed as a field in itself. And agriculture was probably the only use of land, productive use of land existing at that time. So agricultural economics focused on agricultural use of land and questions concerning productivity, soil depletion, and farm management. The field still exists, and the focus has been shifting from productivity issues to other issues like environmental issues and externalities associated with farmland use and other things, which are more nuanced things. Now, while we discuss about the subfields of economics which deal with land-related functions, we will also discuss what are the attributes of land which that particular subfield is interested in. So when we are talking about agricultural economics, the main attributes of land which agricultural economists would be interested in studying will be the quality and productivity of land, because that is having a direct implication on agricultural productivity, which is the main concern of agricultural economics. Now, taking the discussion forward on environmental economics, which focuses on pervasive external effects, irreversibility, non-substitutability, distributional questions. We are not getting in the details of this. This is a specialized field, and I would say this has emerged more recently than as compared to agricultural economics, after the impact of agriculture and especially built environment activities on land became more evident in the form of environmental damage. This field emerged and is focusing on these areas which we just discussed about irreversibility and substitutability and other aspects which are important. Now, when we talk about agricultural economics, we were talking about a piece of land and single ownership, if we may say, in a free market, in a free competitive market, a freehold or a long-term leasehold ownership, and a single piece of land and owned by a particular owner. And the impact of any agricultural activity is confined to its owner. But when we look at not just at the individual level, not just at the micro level, but when we start looking at the level of more than one owner or multiple owners, then we are trying to understand the impact of these activities on each other, on more than one users, on more than one owners. And we also start discussing about spatial interaction between one land parcel and another land parcel. What is the impact of one land parcel on another land parcel? What is the interaction? And in the economics context, the exchange and communication among economic agents is important. So if we are talking about more than one land parcel, more than one individuals, more than one owners, more than one households, then we also need to talk about the exchange among those agents. And that is what spatial economics looks at, where land is the dimension of spatial interaction, of communication and exchange among economic agents. By economic agents, we mean the producers and consumers, who are located in spatially separated locations. So when there is spatial separation and there is need for exchange and communication, then there has to be some medium of interaction, which is usually transportation. And that is what spatial economics looks at, that how do we maximize the utility of land by encouraging and facilitating efficient communication and exchange among economic agents through transportation. So then the decisive attributes of spatial economics become the location and distance and the cost of transport. Now coming to land economics, which is our area of concern here. Land economics interestingly emerged as an offshoot from agricultural economics. So what I will do is I'll take you to the next slide to discuss more in detail about land economics and real estate economics, which are the core concerns for our subject. We also want to understand where are the overlaps between land economics and real estate economics and how are they different. So, as I said, that land economics was a field which emerged as an offshoot of agricultural economics. And the early research question for land economists was to look at how best to bring unused land into agricultural production. Agriculture, as we discussed, was the only productive activity back in time. And it was a lot concerning for economists to understand how can they improve the agricultural productivity. So land economy developed as a concept or as a discipline to look at unused land and how can we bring it into use. But the interesting thing was that there was apparent oversupply of agricultural land at that time, and therefore it was not that big an issue to bring unused land into agriculture. Probably it was not required as well. And if so, it was not as challenging that a new field can survive on that research question. So the research question automatically broadened, and rightly so, not only because the question of unused land was less important, but also because there were other uses emerging. And it was important to look at the concern for those newly emerging uses. So what happened was that the interest of land economics eventually shifted to more general concerns for situations in which land, its use, or limitation to its use was of strategic importance. So what we are saying is that land can be used for non-agricultural uses as well. And the attention of land economics shifted to looking into land uses and their limitations. However, the main tangible product here is still land as a raw material, just land. And the concern here is only land and the use of land. The improvements on land, not in any physical form, but in the form of an agricultural product. So the decisive attribute of land in the context of land economics became the location of land and the physical attributes of land. By physical attributes, we can say the area of land, the productivity of land, the soil quality of land, the organic content in land, the inorganic content in land, and all other physical attributes that will impact upon the use of land. And then there are institutional factors which include social, political, and legal institutions that were decisive attributes for land economy. When we say location of land, we mean two things. One is the location in the context of a particular piece of land, its geographical coordinates. So in the context of real estate, location is a fixed point in space that is linked to other locations. And this linkage and the surrounding uses, commonly referred to as neighborhood, effects or externalities, they influence the productivity of the location. So the first element under location, which is talking about the spatial or geographical coordinates of a particular piece of land and the impact of surrounding land parcels on this particular piece of land. This element, this first point of location is concerning a piece of land, say plot number 1. Now the other important aspect of location is the interaction of plot number 1 with other plots and the exchange between plot number 1 and other plots and the communication between plot number 1 and other plots. So by location, we are concerned with two things. First, the locational quality of a particular piece of land, and second, the medium of communication between two separate pieces of land. So transportation is also an element of location. By saying communication and exchange, we are indirectly talking about transportation. That is how communication and exchange will happen. Now, we have talked about land economics, and the emphasis of land economics is and has been on land itself. Now, when we say real estate economics, we are concerned with two things. First is land as a raw physical product, and then the improvements on land. By improvements, we as property professionals understand that improvement happens on land through investment of capital, and these improvements are usually in the form of built structures that can hold and host various types of use, starting from residential, commercial, retail, warehouse, and everything else that we can think of. Now, these two things are separate and they are brought together under real estate economics. Whereas in land economics, it's only land that we are concerned with. So what happens is that then real estate economics views land as two things. One, as a factor of production, and second, as a product in itself. What do we mean by this? So, land is a factor of production if we are using it to create productive goods. And in this case, we are using land to build improvements on it in the form of built structures, which generate revenue for us. And at the same time, land is a product in itself, because land is saleable, land has value, and as a factor of production, it has value as a product in itself. So indirectly, we are saying that real estate economics entails land economics and also talks about the improvements on land. So it has both the elements in it, and it is probably a wider field than land economics. Wider in terms of scope and coverage. So in that case, the decisive attributes for real estate economics, here we are discussing in two parts. One is the decisive attributes of improvements, which mean the physical characteristics of the improvement on land. Let's say if we are constructing a residential apartment, then the physical characteristics of the residential apartment, its area, its size, its number of units, the quality of construction, material, everything becomes important, and everything adds or affects on the value of the improvement. And then institutional factors, again, social, political, and legal institutional factors are also important determinants of the value and the way the product can be used or exchanged in the market. Alongside these decisive attributes of improvement, since we are talking about improvement and land, so whatever were the elements or decisive attributes of land, those also become the decisive attribute for real estate economic, again going to the location of land, physical attributes of land, and the institutional factors. So at this slide, we need to be very clear of what we mean by real estate economics and what we mean by land economics. So we are saying that land economics is concerned with the use of land, and real estate economics is concerned with land as a factor of production as well as a product. Now I'm giving you a glimpse of the bid rent theory. Now, the bid rent theory, broadly what it says is that the price of land reduces as you go further away from the central business district. This is a very simple explanation of bid rent theory. I'll repeat again that the rent or price or value of land reduces as you go away from the central business district. Why this happens? What has led to this theory? We will discuss in detail. But the interesting thing to ask here is that if the price decreases, how does that impact upon the use pattern? So if the price of land is cheaper at the outskirts, you would expect that agricultural activity, which are land intensive, will happen in the outskirts of the city where land is cheap. As you move closer, probably more competitive uses or more productive uses of land will emerge. So as you move closer, probably residential, and closest to the CBD would be the most productive and most competitive use, which would be commercial. Does it happen? Does this theory apply in reality? Do cities actually follow the bid rent theory? So I will not give the answer in yes or no. Rather, I'll demonstrate you what's happening in Melbourne in 2019 as per the report titled Melbourne Functional Economic Region. Now, this is the origin point in this graph, and x-axis is the land price, and y-axis is the land price, and on x-axis we have mentioned the distance from CBD. So we can see what is the existing land use pattern. As you are close to the CBD and the land price is high, the use that occupies this land is corporate office. Now, at this termination point where commercial node terminates, service, industry, and retailing is the next most competitive use or most productive use, which occupies the distance after corporate office. And in the Melbourne context, it's mixed use. So we do have some residential as well and other uses, service industry uses and retail in this particular stretch, slightly away from the CBD. As you move further away, residential use dominates the geography. And if you will move further away from residential, you will obviously see agricultural, which is not mapped in this particular graph. So what we are trying to say is that most productive uses are located closest to the CBD. And as you move further away from the CBD, land prices reduce, and accordingly, the land use pattern changes. This is, put very simply, what bid rent theory says. Do other cities also follow? Melbourne is a monocentric city, Sydney is a polycentric city, but do other cities, like in developing countries, like in India, Hyderabad, and then Warsaw, do other cities follow the pattern? What we see in these graphs, we can say yes. If the market is freely operating, then this will be the pattern that will emerge. And bid rent theory definitely applies in reality in the context of city. There are exceptions, And once we get into the details of bid rent theory, then we will discuss those exceptions as well. Now, the second most important theory, I'll go back to this slide. So as we said that when we were talking about land, the most important guiding theory, economic theory for us was the bid rent theory. So all our lectures between week 2 to week 5 will be guided by the bid rent theory. When we go to understanding real estate economics, between weeks 7 to 11, we will be guided by the 4-quadrant model introduced by DePascal and Wheaton. So I'll talk briefly about the 4-quadrant diagram here. If you don't understand it today, it's absolutely fine. We are not expecting to get into the details of it today. We are only giving you a short summary of what this theory means and why will it be relevant for us to look at that, just to give you a glimpse of how the subject looks like going forward. Now, you as a property student would have come across property market and sub-market terminology very often. And when we say property market and the sub-markets of property market, we often refer to the use market, investment market, and development market. Now, the DePascal-Wheaton diagram explains the relationship between these. I'll first try to explain the blue side and the gray side. We all understand that property has two roles. Property is an investment and property is a consumption good as well. Now, as a consumption good, we are talking about using property or consuming property as a user. When we say investment in property, we are talking about owning property as an asset. So if we try to split the two functions of use and investment, then we say that on the right side, the blue side, we are talking about the use market or the space market, where the space of the property which is used by a tenant is important. And on the left side, we are talking about the investment or the property as an asset for owner, where transactions happen, where property exchanges hand between two investors. So the asset market on the left. So first, these two broad separation are important to understand, that property has two major roles. It can be, a consumption good and it can be an investment good. Can someone have both? Yes, definitely. That is the person whom we call owner-occupier. So if I have bought a house and I'm living in it, then I am consuming or using property, as well as I have invested in property. So I'm an investor as well as a user of the space. Now, it is easy to split this. Like, for example, if you are an investor in property, then you are not using that property. Rather, you are investing in that property. You are generating rent from that property. And then there is a separate entity or agent who is called the user, who is using the property. So then you are separating the two functions. If you are an investor and not the occupier, then you have separated the two functions. Even if you are an owner-occupier, you can implicitly separate the function. So we understand now that there is a space market, which is the use, because the space is used and the asset is invested or owned. So there is this space market and there is this asset market. Now, let's understand what this diagram is telling. In this diagram, this northeast quadrant talks about the use market, where rents are determined. We are talking about users here, or tenants or occupants, who are different from owners or investors who are in the northwest quadrant. In the northwest quadrant, we are talking about the investors. In the northwest quadrant, we talk about the price and not rent. We talk about the price of property. In the northeast quadrant, we talk about use and rent. In northwest quadrant, we talk about investment and price. In southwest quadrant, we talk about the development market or the supply of new stock. In the southeast quadrant, we again talk about stock adjustment or replacement. So, therefore, this is called the 4-quadrant diagram because there is a y-axis on which we plot rent in the top and construction in the bottom. And there is x-axis where on the right we plot the stock in square feet or in area units. And on the left, we plot the price. So the y-axis and x-axis divides the diagram into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant refers to a different submarket here. Now, not to confuse you, but together the bottom 2 quadrants may be called the development market, but we don't usually do that. We still try to keep the 4th quadrant as stock adjustment quadrant, and we call the development here because this is where the stock is produced. Now, in the first quadrant, which is the use market where rents are determined, we have plotted the demand line which comes from the market. It depends upon the rent and the economic condition. As you can understand from, let's try to understand what is the demand of property, say residential property in Melbourne in the current time. The rents are low, economy is slowing down, unemployment rate is high, earning and income is going down. So at this moment, definitely the demand is going down. And when we plot demand, we are saying that as a function, this line is a function of rent and economy together. So this line is exogenous, only partially dependent on the factors that we have plotted here. So this line comes from the market. At any given point of time, we understand that the stock available in the market, in the property market, is fixed because new stock takes time to be created. It's not a day's activity. Construction takes time. So at any given point in time, the stock available in the market is fixed. To understand the impact of demand or change in demand on rent, we use this quadrant where we know that the stock of property is fixed, and given the stock, what will be the rent? We will try to read the rent by plotting a line upward from the stock, which is the x-axis, and wherever it touches the demand line, we extract a horizontal line and read the rent on y-axis corresponding to that line. So if the stock is Q star and demand is on this line, then the rent will be R star. This is simple, but we will explain this in detail when we move forward and discuss the 4-quadrant diagram in detail. Essentially, what it is trying to say is that for a given stock, when the demand is not changing, we can read the rent on the y-axis. Corresponding to this rent, we can also understand what will be the price of property. by plotting cap rate in northwest quadrant. Again, cap rate is exogenous. We extract cap rate from the market and we plot it here, and then we try to read that if the rent in the market is R star, then what will be the price for the property? And this triggers investors or investment in property market. At the moment, the graph which you are seeing is at equilibrium. The market is at equilibrium. It is a perfectly joined rectangle. So corresponding to R star, the price is P star. And if the price is P star, then how much should be the new stock produced in the market? So if the property is selling at price P per square feet, the construction industry will produce stock equivalent to C star. Again, we are plotting the construction cost in the southwest quadrant, and we are reading C star corresponding to price P star by plotting P star on construction cost and bringing it on the y-axis where construction new stock to be produced in terms of construction square feet is red. Then again, if the construction is C star and the removal rate is this line, then the new stock coming in the market will match exactly the depleted stock or the stock removed from the market, and there will be no oversupply. So C star will try and help retain the stock at Q star. This is a little bit tricky. The entire thing is a little bit tricky. We will deal with it again and again. But what we are trying to say in the southeast quadrant is that there is a stock that is removed from the market because of depreciation and depletion, aging. So we bring down some properties which are no more in use. Every year there is some stock in the property market that is taken out of the market, and that reduces the available stock in the market. Like for example, if you bring down an apartment that is old, so you have essentially reduced some number of units from the market. And we are saying that at an equilibrium, the new stock that is produced by the development industry, which is C star here, is such that it replaces the depreciated or removed stock perfectly and doesn't create oversupply. Rather, it keeps the stock stagnant at the original quantity, Q star. So this is a situation of equilibrium where rents determine the price determine the new stock that should be supplied, and the new stock determines how much is the stock adjustment, and the stock adjustment, if it matches perfectly with the stock demanded and maintains the stock at the same level, then the market is at equilibrium. But the funny part is that the market is never at equilibrium. It can't be. This is the ideal situation we are discussing. But the market always tries to achieve equilibrium. For example, if the demand changes, we know that the market is very dynamic. One or other element keeps changing. One or other graph in either of the four quadrants, be it demand for property, be it the cap rate, be it the construction cost, be it the removal rate, if any of this shifts even slightly, and each of these depend upon some external factors, if they shift slightly, then the entire equilibrium will fall apart and the market will be at inequilibrium. So this is a situation we are trying to demonstrate, that let's say not everything is changing together, but to keep it simple for us, let's say only demand is changing. And you can imagine that we are changing only demand, but the market doesn't work like that. In reality, the cap rate, the cost of construction, the removal rate, everything keeps changing. So you can imagine that the market is never at equilibrium. but it is trying to achieve the equilibrium so that the demand matches supply exactly, and there is neither oversupply nor undersupply, and we can find the price at equilibrium. So again, coming back to the discussion, that what happens when either of these graphs shift. Just to explain it graphically, let's say the demand shifts. In this case, we are saying an increase in demand. So if we try to understand logically, if there is demand increase for property, then rents should increase, property prices should increase, developers will get a sign that they should produce more stock to benefit from the situation, and new stock should come in the market. This is what should happen when demand increases. Now let's see how de Pascal diagram explains this entire cycle that we just discussed. So when demand increases, again we will start by Q star, which is indicative of the stock available in the market. So drawing a line from this point on x-axis vertically upward up till the new demand graph, and then extracting rent by drawing a line horizontally from the demand graph westward to hit the rent axis. We say that the rent has increased from R star to R1. The new rent is R1 in the market now because the demand increased from D0 to D1. So increase in demand led to an increase in rent. Again, the increase in rent, when plotted against the same cap rate, led to an increase in price. The increase in price plotted against same construction cost leads to an increase in construction activity from C star to where this red line intersects the black line. And this increase in stock creates new stock and makes available new stock in the market, which results in an oversupply. We have seen this situation of oversupply. We have seen the situation of undersupply, and this oversupply situation demonstrated here is a long-term phenomena. In the short term, an increase in demand will result in increase in rent. In the short term, increase in rent will result in increase in price, and the increase in price will trigger the construction industry to produce more stock. And in the long term, this increase in demand will result in production of new stock, which may result in oversupply. And oversupply would mean strong reduction in rent, and the cycle will keep on repeating. Reduction in rent will result in reduction in price. Reduction in price will result in less construction activity. Less construction activity will result in undersupply. Undersupply will then again result in increase in rent. So this cycle, so we are saying that the black quadrant, which was the equilibrium, is deviated to become the red dotted line, which is not a full quadrant and therefore a disequilibrium situation. And this disequilibrium will result in another cycle, which will repeat the process of rent adjustments, price adjustments, and construction activity adjustment. And it will eventually achieve a quad equilibrium, or it will eventually try to achieve and move towards a new equilibrium if any of the factors in the quadrant change or shift. So this diagram is a new equilibrium. The question to ask is, can this be a long-run equilibrium result? The answer is, the market is never at equilibrium because something or the other shifts and results in disequilibrium. And the rectangle or the quadrant is never complete. And there is always an attempt to form a new quadrant or a new equilibrium. So this is what de Pascal's theory explains. This is another way of summarizing this simple model. Well, it is simple, believe me, it is simple, and once you will start understanding, it will be even simpler for you. And probably this is the most simple way to explain the relationship between these markets. So let's try to summarize here. This is an interesting paper by Jeffrey Cogg, and I will recommend that you read the paper, at least the part which explains the diagram. And it will be highly recommended that you read the paper by Pascal and Wheaton. It's called The Markets for Real Estate Assets and Space, a Conceptual Framework. And you will get adequate time and you will be explained all this in length as and when we reach that stage in the subject. To summarize the property market model, again, we are talking about three markets: the use market, investment market, and development market. And we are trying to understand the interrelationships here. I'm moving anti-clockwise, and I will be discussing the inner solid lines first. As mentioned earlier, we always separate the space that is used from the asset that is purchased, or in other words, we separate the use of property from investment in property. The consumption and investment are seen as two different purposes. Obviously, these are combined when you buy a property as an owner occupier, but there is good opportunity to split them by being an investor owner, by being a tenant, separately or respectively. So when we say the use market, we are talking about the utilization of space for which you pay the rent. We are not talking about owning a space or investing in property. We are only talking about using the property as a tenant. You could be a residential tenant, it could be a commercial tenant who pays rent. So in this arena of user market, rents are determined depending upon what is the demand for a particular kind of rental space, a particular quality of rental space. So the use market has its own determinants, and those determine the rent. Now, depending upon how much rent is a particular market generating, say a residential market or a commercial market, depending upon what is the rent generated in that market, investors get an insight whether to invest in that market or not. And they create their expectation from the rent that they would want. So the use value of property triggers the investment market. The investment market determines the capital value or the price of property. The investment market is motivated by the required rate of return or the yield. And the investment market determines the price of the property depending upon how much is the demand for investment in a particular kind of property, say retail or commercial or hotel, hospitality, whatsoever it is, and how much is the supply. Depending upon that, the values are determined in the investment market. If the prices are going up or the capital values are going up or the rents are going up, both trigger the development market to develop more stock. Now, you will be thinking that why would rent trigger the development market? Well, there are two reasons. First, because rent will trigger the investment market and investment market will trigger development market. So there is an indirect link. At the same time, there is a direct link because let's imagine the the build to rent model here, where the development of an asset which is built to rent is directly benefited from the rental increase as well as the capital increase, because it involves an investor and a renter at the same time. So an improvement in rent as well as an improvement in price will trigger the development market. And build to rent model is a simple model that helps us understand that. Another reason is explained here in an interaction between the investment market and user market, which is that it is possible to repackage property interest. What does that mean? That means that let's take the current scenario. In the current scenario, people are losing job, people are facing income cuts, and they are yet still to pay their home loans. I'm talking about people who are owner occupiers, for example, of residential property. Now, let's say I'm taking my example. I am supposedly a owner of a property and I'm occupying that property and I'm paying loan for that property. And there is a salary reduction that has happened, because of which I'm unable to pay my loans adequately. So my usual motivation would be to repackage my interest in this property which I'm owning, to sell it and to become a renter. When I will sell it, either it will go to another owner occupier or it may go to an investor who will then hold this asset but will put it on rent. So when I was the owner occupier, I was keeping the two functions together of the user and the investor. But when I'm selling it out, it is possible that the market will repackage it and split the two uses of user and investor. And then there will be an adjustment through repackaging. And that is what is explained here, that it is possible to repackage property interest and split the use market and split the same property in two parts, in the use market and the investment market. And by that split, we will readjust the rent and price. These relationships are very interesting for us to explore. And as we move forward, we will understand this better. Now, through this repackaging, we can do short-term adjustments or short-run adjustments, as we are seeing in the Melbourne market happening now. But through the development market or through production of new supply, we actually do long-run adjustments in the prices and in the stock availability. So this is the crux of it. Now we want to take the subject forward and try to understand the definition or the characteristics of real property by looking into various definitions and characteristics and actors of the property market. So the characteristics of a real property, starting with defining real property. As we have been saying, real property is land or land plus capital together. We are also interested in defining real property as a physical, tangible property, as well as a bundle of rights or legal interest in property. We will talk about this in detail as we move forward in the subject about bundle of rights. As just to explain you briefly, when we say freehold property, we are saying perpetual ownership of land, which will be slightly different from a leasehold property where the tenure of ownership is defined. And like that, we can rebundle the rights and the duration for which those rights are available to the owner or the user. we can rebundle those things in various ways, and therefore we call property as a bundle of right, and depending upon what that bundle contains, the value of property may change. So property is not just the physical property, it is also the bundle of rights. And defining the real property market. Now, it is interesting that in the property market, we are not only concerned about the outcome of any transaction, which is the price. Rather, we are very concerned about the mechanism for reconciling demand and supply. What do we mean by this? Let's take a small example. You go to Woolworths, you buy milk, which has a fixed price tag. You know what the price is. You know that everyone else is buying at that price. You pay that. You don't negotiate. You bring that product home and you are happily using it. Does this happen in the property market? You go to buy a property. Do you have prior knowledge on how much the property would be sold for? The best you know is the asking price. Do you have full information about what are the attributes of that property? You may try your best, but still you will not have full information. If nothing, you will not know the substructure of the property, which is beneath the ground. So information on price, attributes, both is difficult, unlike the information on milk available at Woolworth. Then when you go, you just don't, ask the agent, he tells you a price and you bring back property home. No, you negotiate, you compete, you bid. So the mechanism of reconciling demand and supply through which the price is determined is important and is peculiar to real property market. Is the market formal or informal? When we say formal, we mean those set of activities that are recognized and acknowledged and acceptable under the legal framework. When we say informal, we are meaning to say these are not acknowledged, and I'll give you an example that almost 70% of land in the world is unregistered, which means it is informal. You do not know who is the conclusive owner. Only 30% land is registered, and for that information is available on about owner, and transaction can happen. But does the 70% land which is not registered, does it not transact? It does. It transacts informally. So informality is a very integral part of property market, and a lot of informal transactions happen in the real property market, and it is not only in the context of transaction but also in the use market, in the investment market, in the development market. In all three markets, formality and informality exist. Whether property is one market or many markets. We have already been talking about three sub-markets in property: the use market, the investment market, and the development market. But this could also mean markets in terms of different geographies, markets at the city level, markets at the global level, and markets at the national level. So it could mean many things. It is definitely a multi-market system. Who are the participants? How do we define the participants in the real property market? We know that there are owners and users of property, whom we may call the investors or occupiers. Then there are producers of property, who are the developers, constructors, etc., who are concerned with supply of property. Owners and users will be concerned or will be impacting upon the demand. Producers will be impacting the supply. And then there are agents, advisors, and financiers who facilitate the exchange between the producer and the consumer. And that is what encapsulates the participants together. Again, coming to the characteristics of real property and comparing it with other financial assets, there are some very peculiar characteristics of real property. Firstly, it involves high transaction cost. Why is the cost of transaction high? You can imagine that property is a very bulky asset, and there are a lot of formalities required when a bulky asset like property exchanges hand. There are legal fees, there are processing fees, there are some taxes involved, there is information gathering cost, and there are various other such costs involved. And therefore, transacting property is not as easy in terms of cost as, say, transacting other financial assets like stocks. Property is indivisible. You can't be selling one bedroom to someone and the toilet to someone else and the kitchen to someone else. It is indivisible as a unit. Unlike stock, where the subdivision is possible up to a very small denomination, property is sold as a unit which is indivisible. We may say that land is divisible if we are saying that land as a property is to be sold, then yes, it is divisible, but only to the extent that the division is usable. You can't be selling 1 square meter of land. No one will buy it. It's still a divided unit, but no one will buy it because it's non-usable. So property becomes indivisible as an asset, unlike other financial assets that have a very low denomination of division. Property is difficult to liquidate. You are trying to convert a physical, tangible asset into cash, and it requires marketing, it requires finding the right buyer, it requires meeting expectations of the right selling price. And it is difficult to liquidate. All these processes consume time and cost. It can't be instantaneous like buying and selling other financial assets like stocks. Property is a very durable asset in terms of physical durability. It is inelastic in supply. The supply of property doesn't change. It is a long-term process, so it is inelastic. It is heterogeneous, which means that no two properties are similar. Each property has a peculiar characteristic. Location in itself is a very peculiar characteristic of a property. No property has the same location. Even if it has the same location, like for example, multi-tower buildings where there are different flats at the same floor level, then also the characteristic of each flat, say the entry, the direction, facing of windows, those things will be different. So each property is different, and therefore each property is sold at a different price. There is monopoly power, which means which is derived from the location attribute of property. At a particular location, there is only one piece of land existing. And if I am the owner of that piece of land, it gives me the monopoly because no other piece of land exists at that location. And this monopoly power is seen on the face when, let's say, a project is to be built, say a hospital or a road is to be constructed, and a sequence of contiguous parcels of land is required for that road to be built. And then compulsory acquisitions happen because not everyone will be happy to sell their land because everyone has a monopoly and they may strategically ask for higher price or they may negotiate harder. And therefore, to break that monopoly, government introduces the compulsory or uses the compulsory purchase power to break that monopoly. So there is no competition because I am the only person who owns that particular location. So it gives me the monopoly by the location of my property. Then there are external cost and benefit which affect the particular piece of land. which we call externalities, positive or negative externalities, which means to say that my piece of land doesn't only benefit or is depreciated or impacted by the characteristics of the piece of land which I am owning, but it is also impacted by the characteristics of pieces around my land. As we discussed under location earlier, that it is linked to other pieces around or other properties around. For example, if my piece of land is located somewhere and the next day there is let's say industry built next to my land, if my land is residential use, the industry will depreciate its use. That's a negative externality on my piece of land. So my piece of land does get affected by external cost and benefits. Property is controlled by the government in various ways. For example, the use of property, the density or the height up to which you can build. All these things are regulated by the government. Again, this is linked to this aspect of external cost and benefit, because one property can cause externalities on other, and therefore there has to be a synergy between the uses across contiguous parcels of land in the same neighborhood. So there are government controls to reduce negative externalities specifically. There are different attitudes to property. This is to say that in the first place, there will be difference in attitude. Say, for example, an investor's attitude would be to make money from the property, whereas a consumer's attitude would be to consume the property. So both will be looking at property differently. Even among investors, there will be different motivation and attitude towards property. Someone might be trying to look at a property in Turek for prestige point of view. Someone might be trying to look for a property which is large enough for kids to bring up. And there could be different different attitudes to property with which people will buy the property. When you are talking about financial assets, there is only one reason, motivation, which is investment. But in property, the attitudes may be different. This is very important, imperfect information. So property market does not have perfect information. The property market information is very difficult to find, and there is a cost to finding that information. And even when there is information available, not everyone has same amount of information, and there are asymmetries across different people. So there is imperfect information in the property market. The property market facilitates accumulation of wealth. It's a bulky asset, and at any time you have to invest a lump sum large amount of money to buy that asset. Unlike in financial assets, where you are having the flexibility to how much you want to invest. Property will be an accumulation of capital, a large sum of money. Moving forward, talking about other characteristics of property market, focusing on assessing property market outcomes. How do we assess the outcome? We try to understand whether the highest and best use of land and property resources was secured or not. Is all land and property that we see around us, is everything optimally utilized to its highest and best use? The answer is no, and it can't be ever. Does that make property market outcome inefficient? Again, that is a research question to be asked, and we can look into it depending upon how are we defining efficiency. Does property market secure an acceptable use of land and property resources? Here we are meaning to say acceptable to the community, to the society. For example, many a times we see that in low-rise residential areas, when high-rise developments are permitted, even though they are the highest and best use, they are not acceptable. Often the residents raise complaint and raise objections against such development. So whatever we see around us is existing only because eventually it was acceptable, or at times not acceptable, but yet it is executed. Is the real property market efficient? There is a very interesting paper, again by Jeffrey Kaw, and it is titled Property Market Efficiency, an Institutional Economics Perspective. This is an interesting paper if you want to read. I have mentioned the reference here. It talks about efficiency in different ways. First is informational efficiency, and in property market there is never adequate information and there is always information asymmetry. So there is informational inefficiency in the property market all the time. Bounded efficiency, which means if a person or an individual is bounded by inefficiency, mostly in the context of informational efficiency. As an individual, I have limited information and therefore I'm inefficient in forming a decision. There is never perfect information in the property market, and there are asymmetries, and therefore there are personal level inefficiencies in the property market when it comes to taking decision, and that becomes the bounded inefficiency with which a person is bounded or the decision is bounded. Then there is purpose inefficiency. This means that the purpose for which the property should be used, let's say when you do the highest and best use analysis, you are trying to identify what should be the use, and there could be multiple uses. You can't be looking at all the uses. Like for example, you may choose to look at commercial, retail, housing, but you can't be looking at institutional and museum and every type of use that is feasible, because the information on each use type or each purpose for which the property will be used, it is very difficult to find information in depth on each purpose. Also, information on different purpose or use will be available at different levels. Like for example, if you have to build a school somewhere, schools don't transact often. Schools are not constructed as often as residential, and therefore the information availability for school development or the purpose of school will be less as compared to for, say, residential or commercial, which is constructed and transacted more often. So there is purpose inefficiency, there is person inefficiency, and both is linked to informational inefficiency. So then the question is property market efficient? And this paper will give you the answer, where the authors are rightly arguing that the parameters for efficiency for property market should not be the same as for other financial assets. We need to understand that these are the characteristics of property market. There are informational asymmetries, inefficiencies, and there are bounded inefficiencies. And within these characteristics, we should be trying to analyze the efficiency of the market. And not having information or having bounded inefficiency itself doesn't mean that the market is inefficient. When it comes to institutions, I will request you to refer to lecture 1 part 2, where I have invited Piyush as an expert on institutions, and we will be talking about these things for a richer understanding of these topics. So I'm skipping these slides here, and I'll cover these slides in my discussion with Piyush. We are reaching the end of this lecture, and at the end I would like to summarize the intended learning outcomes of this subject. We want to develop fundamental knowledge of economic theories which guide the land and property market, and in the context of this subject we are talking about the theory of bid rent and the theory of 4-quadrant diagram. We will formulate general explanations of property market behavior that is the use, investment, and development markets. We will apply the theories of economics to understand the distribution of property right among different stakeholders like the users and investors, the causes of urban informalities and socio-economic segmentation of urban spaces. We will discuss about this briefly in week 6 probably. In this subject, one intention is also to explain the activity and outcomes in specific property markets, which are defined by sector, location, and function. This will be an ongoing discussion when we start talking about the property section after week 7. Sorry, after week 6, I guess. Making a critical economic assessment of land use policies and methods of policy delivery. We will talk about this in week 6 when we are talking about planning as an institution. Overall, we will develop economic analytical skills that are required in the property discipline, and we will apply them in investigating problems concerning land and property. And these problems could vary, starting from unaffordability to demand and supply mismatches, housing for the poor and aged, and an interesting topic about rights on property. Now, having achieved these outcomes, would you think you would be, confident as a land and real estate economist and valuer, and you would be confident to perform the duties which include, say, if you choose to, do research on property rights and regulations, market trends, current demand and factors that influence the sale and value of land and property. The role of land and real estate economist and valuer also includes to offer guidance on the most lucrative and beneficial use of land. So we are essentially talking about property rights, regulations, use, and improvements, efficient utilization of land and resources. And as property land economists and valuers, you will also appraise the value of land and property. And that probably those of you who have already undertaken the subject of property markets valuation, they know, and if you haven't, then you will get to know that in estimating the value of property, you need to have a good understanding of market. Lots of determinants of value come from the market. And this subject will help you understand what are the determinants of those values, what are the demand and supply drivers. So overall, these are the tasks and duties that are expected out of a real estate professional, and this subject builds the foundation for these tasks for you in the future. The skills required as a real estate professional are analytical skills, critical thinking skills, problem-solving abilities, attention to detail, communication skills, both written and oral, and strong knowledge of market price of land, and to be updated on emerging changes. So I hope that we will cover good enough information and knowledge in the domain of land and property economics, and you will be able to build these skill sets in the course of this subject and in the course of your property education. So again, there is a slight typo here. This is supposed to be the summary. So to summarize our discussions from today's lecture, we want to say that land and property economics is a subfield in economics, which is concerned with land as a product as well as a factor of production. This subject will cover two important economic theories in detail to explain land and property markets respectively. The problems related to land use, price, and density will be explained using the bid-ring theory, and the relationship between property markets of use, investment, and development would be explained using the 4-quadrant diagram. We also discussed about the characteristics of real property. We discussed the definition of real property, the definition of real property market, we understood the participants, we understood the special characteristics of real property as compared to other financial assets. We also understand that assessing property market outcomes is not easy and is different from assessing outcomes of other financial assets, which may have more information symmetry. And we also questioned the efficiency of property market given the set of characteristics it has. And we will be understanding property market and institutions in the second part of this lecture with Piyush. So I will stop here and I will meet you again in the second part of the lecture.